Imagine we want to build a Bootstrap panel component. So I've created a new component called panel component. You can see the selector for this component is bootstrap-panel. So here I have used bootstrap to prefix this selector because we don't want to use panel because chances are this name is going to clash with another component. So as a best practice, if you're building reusable components, always prefix them. So here, bootstrap-panel. Now, let's go to the template for this panel. In order to render a bootstrap panel, we need a div with two classes. So .panel and .panel-default. So if you press tab here, we get this markup, right? Now, let's undo this. I want to add more markup here, so we generate it in one go. Now, inside this div, we want to have another div with the class panel-heading. And next to this div, we want to have another div with the class panel-body. Now tab, this is our markup. So let's just put some label here, heading and body. Now back in the browser, this is a Bootstrap panel. It's a nice user interface component. Now let's make this dynamic. So I don't want to hard code this heading and body labels here. I want the consumer of this panel component to be able to inject text or markup into this component. So let's go to app-component.html. This is where we have used the Bootstrap panel. Now, in order to set the heading and the body, one way is to use property binding. So we can define input properties like heading and body and set them to the body property of app component. But this syntax is a little bit weird here because I don't want to go in app component, define a property called body, and there add my markup. I want to be able to write my markup right here. So let me show you a better way. Instead of using property binding with input properties, we're going to use the ngContent element. So let's go to the template for panel component. So here, we want to add two injection points so the consumer of this panel component can provide content into those injection points. So here inside panel-heading, I'm going to add an element called ngContent. This is a custom element defined in Angular. And similarly, I'm going to add this inside panel-body because I want the consumer of this component to be able to provide content that should be placed here at runtime. Now here we have two ngContent elements. Somehow we need to distinguish them. We need to give them some kind of identifier. So we use the select attribute, select, and set this to a CSS selector. We can reference a class, an ID, or an element. So here I'm going to use a CSS class like .heading. So if in the consumer of this panel component, we have an element that matches this selector, which means an element with the heading class, that element is going to be placed right here instead of ng-content. In other words, ng-content is going to be replaced with that element. Okay? Now similarly, I'm going to set the select attribute here and set this to .body. Now let's go back to our app component. Here inside the bootstrap-panel element, I'm going to add two divs, one with the class heading, and next to that, I'm going to add another div with the class body. Okay, now let's set our custom content. So here's the heading, and here's the body. Or we can add complex HTML markup here. So we can have, let's say, an H2, here's the body. Below that, we're going to have a paragraph with some content here. Okay, now let's preview this in the browser. So look, this way we can provide custom content to our reusable components. So if you're building reusable components, like in this case, a Bootstrap panel, and you want the consumer of these components to be able to provide custom content, use the ngContent element.